Good morning everyone and welcome to the Terminations and Express Leave webinar. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes for a few people to arrive and then we'll get started. Okay, we might get started. So if anyone has any technical difficulties or questions, if you just pop them into the questions box on the webinar panel, we'll get someone to help you with those. What we will also be doing is we won't have questions throughout the presentation today, but at the end we can go through any questions. So if you do have questions throughout, just pop them in the questions panel and we'll get back to everyone at the end if we've got time to go through them. If not, we'll email a full list of questions out to everyone. All right, so good morning, I'm Michelle Levers and I'm the Payroll Product Manager at Attaché Software, and today we're going to be going over the termination calculator and also Express Leave. So you'll notice I'm using Attaché BI, but if you're not using BI, that's fine. The termination calculator and items we'll go through today all also exist in the Accounts 1X product as well. So no matter what version I'm using today, everything that you see you'll also have available to yourself as well. So let's get started. So just before we begin, as Attaché software developer, we do not provide any legal advice around terminations. So the items that we'll be going through today is basically how to use Attaché software termination calculator and how to enter a termination into Attaché payroll. If you do have any legal questions or need to have a little bit more understanding around what makes up terminations, a really good resource is the ATO website. So we can provide all these links as well after the webinar today. So they go through just what is a termination, what makes up a termination, and how to classify those. So if you do have any sort of, I guess, legal legislation, we are technically not able to assist you with that, but there's plenty of resources that we can provide to you to get those answers. Okay. So with the termination calculator, it is very reliant on your employee setups and the setups within your payroll system being correct. So before you use any of the termination calculators, you should make sure that your employee master file is correct with all the valid information. So we're just going to jump into the employee master file. So master files, payroll, employee details, and inquire or maintain. So select the person that you're going to process a termination for, or it might be a redundancy, etc. So the key points that you need to check is to make sure, of course, that their start date is correct, that their date of birth is correct, that obviously their rates of pay are all correct, and their tax table, and then down into the leave table, so making sure that their leave balances and associated leave accruals are actually correct. Okay. So if we just jump into the setups now, so setups, payroll, options, payroll options. And if we just page down into the tax information screen, so when it comes to the taxation and the thresholds for the termination calculator, all the information is actually held in the payroll options. So if there's any changes around tax for particular elements on termination, they are provided and updated within the tax tables. So we always make sure that you have so a good thing to always make sure is that you have the latest tax tables, that the dates are all correct, the starting tax year, and the effective for payments date is also correct. So this financial year we obviously had a update in the tax tables on the 1st of October. So just making sure that you do have the latest tax tables and information. So if we just page down to the ETP tax details. So basically these are all the tax percentages that the calculator will use for the various payouts of leave, whether it's a death benefit or an ETP or a lump sum D, all the different thresholds are set up within here. So we do provide those to you, but it's always good to make sure that you have got the correct information set up in there. So we just update, press down a little bit further. So these are also the tax information associated with the ETPs. So it's just good to know when you are using the termination calculator, if one of the tax calculation you don't agree with, it's always good to see how we're actually calculating it, and the tax information is all held in the payroll options. Okay, so if we now jump into transactions, payroll, termination calculator, and termination pay calculator. So the termination pay calculator can be used to create multiple, schedules or terminations for your various employees. So the company might potentially be going through, say, a whole bunch of redundancies, and they're wanting to see what potentially the liability is for various different employees. So you can basically select any number of employees, enter a termination, basically enter in the termination calculator, and then you can print a schedule to basically show what the potential payout to that employee is going to be. So you can try different scenarios or different types of termination. So just going to jump in. I'm just going to select Joe. So we want to add new termination and start with an empty schedule. Okay. So if we just jump through, it'll automatically populate a lot of information based on Joe. So as I mentioned earlier, you need to make sure that the employee master file is correct, because it's going to pull through a lot of information relating to Joe from the employee master file. So start date, you would need to enter in the termination date, so when that employee is going to actually terminate. So as an example, Joe was actually going to terminate as per yesterday. We'll pop that in. And then we select the reason for the termination. So resignation, termination, dismissal, and retirement basically are where the employee has pretty much, well, apart from dismissal, but the employee is elected to resign from the organisation or retire from the organisation. So generally these elements are just pay out of the usual things on termination. So it might be annual leave, long service leave, or potentially elements that you've agreed to as part of their termination. When we get into genuine redundancy and invalidity, then you basically have potentially an employment termination payment. So there's potentially a lump sum D component or an ETP. That's where the confusion can sometimes come in. So just to let you know, there was a change in 2012 around terminations, especially in reference to ETPs. We moved from a transitioning arrangement into the ETP and the different thresholds. Now, at the moment, the termination calculator only handles one threshold, which is the ETP threshold, so the ETP cap threshold. There is another cap that needs to be taken into consideration if your employee is entitled to an employment termination payment, which is an ETP, which is the whole of income cap. So Attaché is not currently handling the whole of income cap in the termination calculator. So if your employee does potentially have an ETP or they do have an ETP, we suggest that you always check that the whole of income cap, which you can jump onto the ATO website and look at the rules around that, that the employee is better off overall. Okay. So I'm just going to select genuine redundancy for Joe. So as I mentioned, with the change in 2012, there's no more transitional payment. So this tick box does no longer apply. So we then select what pay rate the employee would be paid at. So generally it's obviously always their ordinary pay. Their termination age, so that's automatically calculating based on their birth date that's in their employee master file, and then obviously the termination date that you enter. So obviously the termination age is very important when you're looking at genuine redundancy and early retirement and invalidity because of the preservation age. So just always make sure that you have the correct birth date of the employee and the correct age is displaying, because obviously the tax is quite different depending on that preservation age. So the next thing is obviously the length of service is broken down into all the different buckets. So depending on when the employee started, there's obviously different buckets of where the leave has been accrued, and depending on different years of how that is then treated for tax calculations. So again, very important that that start date is correct and that termination date is correct so that the various different lengths of service can be calculated correctly. And the same goes for obviously the length of service down here. So unused leave payments, so depending on your organisation, and I suggest you always check your employment contracts as well and your awards and EBAs of what elements of leave that you actually pay out on the various terminations, whether it be genuine redundancy or a general termination, to make sure that you are meeting all your, I guess, employer obligations in the type of leave that you're paying out to your employees. So depending on your selections here, will determine what then populates on the screens moving forward. So if we just page down. So based on Joe's start date with the organisation and the amount of leave that is accrued over the year or the lifetime of the employment, he falls into the different categories of pre-93 and post-93 for his unused annual leave. So due to it being a genuine redundancy, it then populates into the various different buckets for display on the payment summary. So in the case of Joe being a genuine redundancy, because he does have some leave into the different years, it will be populated on the payment summary under the lump sum A. So if it was a general, just to give you an idea, if it was a general termination and resignation, so you can see how the effect of, depending on the type of termination, so whether it be a genuine redundancy or whether it's just a general Joe is leaving the organisation, terminating, how it's classified and how the tax is calculated is different. So really need to make sure that you classify the reason for the termination, because it can greatly affect which buckets on the payment summary or which boxes on the payment summary it populates for that individual. So as we move down, Joe was entitled to long annual leave loading. So again, a lot of companies now don't do annual leave loading, so always need to make sure that on the employee master file, that if your employee is entitled to annual leave loading, you do have the associated, just page down. If you do have the associated annual leave loading, you have the correct percentages applied. Okay. Okay. If annual leave loading was not populated or set to no, there would be no annual leave loading calculated in the termination calculator. So if we just page down, so moving through to long service leave, again, so depending on when the long service leave was accrued, basically it would populate in the various different areas of the termination calculator. So these different associated leave balances by his rate, and then which element on the payment summary is going to actually populate. So if we'd selected to pay out some other unused annual leave, so as your organisation might pay out sick leave or RDOs or even study leave, or you might have some user-definable leave as part of your organisation, generally if they're not a defined or in their employment contracts or their award, and if it's just your company has decided to pay out those leave, they would be classified as an ETP. But again, obviously, always double check that with your legal advice, whether it be the ATO or your accountant, to make sure that you are classifying those extra elements that you're paying out correctly. So on the final screen, what it'll do is it'll give you a bit of an idea of what this employee is then entitled to. So it'll classify all the various different elements that we've seen in the previous screens. It will show you the value and the rate and then the line total, and then obviously it's calculating the tax and the net pay. So if there was an element that you did pay out on termination and it wasn't defined in the calculator itself or part of the standard Attaché setup, you can add additional elements in. So if we just come under, setups, payroll, income types, termination pay type, maintain. So you can add additional elements into here with descriptions so that you can use those in the termination calculator for your basically estimating of how much an employee is entitled to on termination. Okay, so if we were happy for that as example 1 for Joe, if we just select finish and yes, we can then actually go back and print a report that you can issue to the employee, or perhaps it's to management. So just under transactions, payroll, termination calculator, and termination pay statement. So if you just select the employee code, and you can select the employee, so you have the ability to print all the calculation details. You know, you can include terminated employees. So if someone was already terminated and you wanted to try out some scenarios because potentially maybe it wasn't quite correct on termination, you can do that also. Or you can just print total, and you can include report total, sorry. So we'll just select print. This will print a statement for Joe. So you can then save this as PDF and attach it to their employment records. You could also issue it to the employee with their final pay advice. Or you might be just trying different scenarios so that the company knows what they're liable for, so it can be passed on to management for discussion. So what it then populates for you is basically all the information that you've entered or that has pulled from the employee master file. So employment start dates, termination date, age, obviously it's listing the preservation age because of when the employee was born, termination age, and then through to the length of service, and then a little further down it runs through all the actual figures of what the different elements are payable on termination, so hours, the totals, what of that is taxable, and the tax that it's actually calculated, also where it's going to display on the payment summary. So this is what you would then use to actually enter into the timesheet for the employee. So just coming down. So based on this employee, because it was a genuine redundancy, there is an ETP component and a lump sum D component, being the tax-free component. So it then lists out as well basically the different areas for your ETPs and the tax associated with those. So we would take this information, jump into transactions, payroll, timesheet. So terminations can be done either through timesheets or adjustments. Timesheets would obviously do some of the automatic calculating based on the employee master file, or adjustments allows you to enter with the flexibility of entering an amount of hours at any defined rate and the line total. We always suggest when it comes to terminations that you would do your final pay for the employee, being any hours that they've worked, finalise that off so all the leave accrual is up to date, and then enter the termination pay as a separate pay run. The reason for that is that then there's no missed accrual. You're not forecasting based on what you think the employee is going to have or entitled to leave. You do that final pay based on the hours that they've worked for their final period, and then process the termination as a separate entry. So it's purely just final week of pay, they get their pay slip, or the final month of pay, fortnight, and then process the termination as a separate entry. It's very clear then to the employee, they see their final pay, they see what leave balances that they've got up until, and then when the termination, it's a lot easier for them to basically reference between the two and see their entitlements. So that's just our suggestion, and that way it's a lot easier for you to then not have to do any calculations of estimating of leave. So if we just jump into create or modify, if we select Joe, so he's an auto-pay employee usually. Bigger. So I'm going to start with his standard pay and select termination. So generally when it's their final pay, we do put a pay description on. It's nice and easy then in your list and your reports to identify why there potentially is such an increase in salary or for that weekly run. Termination. So because it is a termination, we don't want to be accruing leave on that final pay. We're just paying out what is entitled to, so you can unselect accrue leave. Now by ticking the box of termination, this little option here being term pay pops up. So if you just select that, you then have the ability to enter any of the values. So on my report, you can see here it's listed all my elements that I would put into my lump sum A, my lump sum, lump sum A, and my lump sum D, and my ETP. So I would just be taking those values and popping those into the various buckets with then the tax that's associated with them. The important thing to do is make sure that you classify them correctly. So if it is a redundancy, then selecting redundancy, and also very important with the ETP that you're classifying that correctly. So the change that was made a few years ago with the ETPs is there's a character that prints on the ETPs for the tax office to be basically notified of whether it was a redundancy, and other ETP. So potentially there was some other elements that you paid out on termination, but it wasn't due to a redundancy. It was, excuse me, potentially some leave that you wouldn't usually pay out on termination, or a death, or etc., a prior year redundancy. So always make sure that if there is an ETP that you classify that correctly, because when the employee receives that payment summary, they'll have the right classification on that. So if we then just move through into the gross, any elements, and I've just closed my report, I think. Yep, so any elements that were defined as gross, which there is none for the genuine redundancy for Joe, you would basically put those into the normal area of a timesheet. So this is any area, so anything that's classified as gross would go into the normal screen that you're used to. Anything that is defined as a lump sum would be populated into the termination on the front screen, or the ETP. Okay, so I'm just going to make sure I've covered everything from a termination perspective. And as I mentioned, if there's any questions, just send them through in the chat, and we can come back to you at the end, or we'll send out all questions to the group and everyone that attended so they can see, because potentially a question you have, somebody else might have asked. Okay. So now I'm going to jump into Express Leave. Okay, so Express Leave is our online application that basically allows your employees to apply for leave online So basically removing the need for manual paper forms, or potentially you're using spreadsheets or collecting various other methods, to basically remove that and collect all the information online. So when it comes to Express Leave, it's available for free for companies that have moved to Attaché BI and are using the Alex Connect software. So if you're sending documents electronically. So if you are using Attaché accounts or the 1X product, just have a chat with your consultant, Brendan, or his team to discuss how you can get Express Leave. So just going to jump into company details. So basically how we set up Express Leave for your organisation is you would contact your partner, who in turn would contact Attaché Software. We would set you up with an account and administrative user to basically start the ball rolling. So pretty much we grab some initial details from you around your company, what country you're in and what state, and what your standard working hours per day are for your employees. Once that administrator has been set up, they will actually get an email from Express Leave or from Attaché that basically invites them to join the organisation. So what they then will have the ability to do is log in, come into the maintain users, and they can create all the employees of their organisation. So what we've also done is given you the ability to basically import information from Attaché BI or 1X, Attaché accounts, and basically create a export and drop your employee information into Express Leave. So I'll just take you through how that actually works. So on the employee master file, so master files, payroll, employee details, inquire. We have the option to do the F11 output, which is known as the list wizard. So this is slightly different between accounts or our 1X product and Attaché BI. So with Attaché BI, you'll obviously notice the minute that we log in here that it's a completely different look and feel. So you can also save layouts, you can add columns by just searching, whereas within the old accounts product you obviously have to scroll along and select the columns individually. So yeah, there is a difference between accounts and BI when it comes to the list wizard or the F11 output. So what we do to get started with Express Leave is, rather than having to set up all your employees in the online product individually, you can basically create an export from the list wizard, so by adding all the fields that we've defined in the list here. So you do need obviously an employee code and an employee email. Generally we recommend a work email. The reason for that is it's a business application, so if we were to differentiate between MyPay and payslips, we generally recommend a personal email address because they can take their MyPay account with them. So if they go to another organisation, they can then start to receive, if they're using Attaché, their payslips into that MyPay account as well, and obviously it gives them a full history of any documents that have been sent. So when we come to Express Leave being a business application, we recommend work email addresses because they wouldn't be taking this with them. So it's purely just for the organisation that they're working for at the time. If you don't have work email addresses for your employees, by all means you obviously can use personal email addresses. When an employee does leave an organisation, you can obviously remove them from Express Leave so that they no longer have access when they terminate. So just coming back into the list wizard. So if I want to pop in email, so Attaché email. I want to bring over some annual leave balances, so my annual leave accruals, some annual leave entitlements, and also want to bring in my sick leave. here it is here. So you get the idea. You can basically bring in any of the fields that we've defined here that you can bring in. Save those as your saved screen layout. So each time you then log in, it will automatically have those saved for you, so that you don't have to add those columns in each time. You can then print all. And if you then pop that into a CSV file or an Excel file, we can then import that into Express Leave. So if I just save that, I've already got one, so if you just save one. So, okay. So what I can then do is I just go to my desktop. There's the file there. So I can actually drag and drop that in, or you can also click and select and browse to the file. But it's nice and easy, you can just drag and drop. What that will then do is actually read it into Express Leave. So these are all the employees that you're obviously, because I've already got a predefined base, updating these employees with the new information I've provided. It asks you how your leave balances are displayed. So if you've got your leave balances in days in Attaché, you just have changed them to days. It's how we just interpret those leave balances and then display them in the system. So once you've got all your employees into the system, if you come on to Manage Users, you'll see the big listing of your employees here. So any employees, you can then send a welcome email. What then happens is the employee will receive that welcome email to their email address. They can then click to log in and create their own password, and then they'll have access to Express Leave. So if I just jump in from an employee's perspective, so as an employee, when I log in, I'll be greeted by my Leave homepage. It'll show me how many leave, how much leave I have to take. Now, as an administrator of the system, you can actually define what leave you want to show for your employees, and if you upload balances, then that will display for them. So to set that up, I'm just going to come down into the Manage Leave types, create a new type. So if you enter in the type of leave and whether you want to actually make that visible to the employee. So these all just should match up with your Attaché BI leave items. So as an example, you might have personal carers leave, should be personal carers leave, the code that matches Attaché BI, any notes that you have regarding that. So you can put in here, you might want to state that they can only take 2 consecutive days with a doctor's certificate. So that will display when they're actually selecting this type of leave to alert them that they must provide a doctor's certificate or a medical certificate. And then if you are going to bring balances in from Attaché BI, you just select which balance it corresponds with. The next element is then who it's actually visible to. Okay, so if you have it as administrator, only the administrator can see it. If you have it as HR, both the administrator and HR can see it. If you have it as the employee approver, it's basically the managers. Employee, everyone can pretty much see it. We do also have the ability to set up non-Attaché users. So if you have potentially some contractors or people that you don't pay through payroll, they can also use this system. You would just set them up as a non-payroll user. So if I just jump into here, create a new user. So under the user type here, you can actually define a non-employee. Okay, so just coming back to the My Leave area. So it will show me my leave balances, as I mentioned, and then coming down it will also show me any history of leave that I've requested in the past and what the status of it is. So what periods I've applied for, what's the type of leave and for how long, what's the status, so whether it's pending approval by a manager or it's been approved, who is the approver, and when it was created. So they've got the full history of what they've requested in the past. To request leave, I just come under the request leave option. I can select my dates. So let's say I'm taking some time off over Christmas, or just before Christmas, I should say. Whether it's annual leave, whether it's long service leave. So if I just say annual leave, it'll automatically calculate how many days that is and how the number of hours. Now that's all based on what you've set up against the employee. So if you've defined that their standard hours are only five hours, then it will obviously be the number of hours that they've worked depending on the period, okay, based on their setups. They can then have the ability to assign it to who they wish to approve the leave. A lot of systems lock you into only allowing to have one approver for a particular person. With Express Leave, what it actually does is it always defaults to who you've defined as their approver, but they can actually select to have it approved by somebody else. Now, even though that can, I guess, from an employee perspective, they could, assign it to anyone they wanted to, there's an actual audit report that defines if anyone's actually changed their approver to somebody else. So as a HR manager or an administrator of the system or the payroll processor, you can then run that audit report to make sure the correct people have been approving the employee's leave. The reason why we introduced that flexibility was so that, if a manager's on leave or, out of the office, the employee can, quickly make that decision to assign it to another manager to get that leave approved. Okay, so they can also upload files, so if there's a supporting doctor's certificate or potentially it might be jury duty or you might want them to upload, it could be anything. You can attach a document to the actual leave request, so when that goes through to the manager they can then see the associated and supporting documentation. They can pop in some comments, so they might like to explain why they're taking this leave, a trip to Hawaii or anything. They can pop in comments, so this will go to the manager as well. So if they just submit that leave request, that'll actually send an email off to the manager to say that they've got a new leave request, and a little later on I'll show you basically from a manager's view what they then see. So from an employee's perspective, they can then see on their My Leave homepage that that leave request has been sent off to their approver for their 5 days for the December period, and they then have the ability to basically, it's sitting there waiting for approval. If they no longer want to take the leave, they can cancel it, edit it. If it's a future date leave request, they can do that. If it's for a period that's been already passed, so say they were entering sick leave in for last month, they would not have the ability to cancel it. Basically, it's a previous date, it's not a future date. So if I just come into the leave calendar, so the leave calendar then displays for all employees, so it's everyone that has entered leave into the system, so all employees can see all leave that the employees have applied for, and it will display in the calendar to the periods that they're out of the office. So what we've found is some companies are also, if an employee is just working from home, they've been entering it through the leave system as well, so that the company has that visibility to where staff are in the organisation. So it's really good for planning or events or just even OH&S who's in the office at a particular time who's not. So we also have the public holidays listed in the system. So if an employee is set up to be a New South Wales, an Australian employee, we've got all the public holidays for that. So if they're requesting leave over Christmas, and obviously with Christmas Day, Boxing Day, etc., all the public holidays, it'll automatically take those out of the leave request. So it won't count those as a day of leave. It will already deduct the public holidays for them. So the employee can also get quick access to MyPay as well, so they can launch into their MyPay account and log into their Attaché online account to see all their payslip history. So it's just linking them all together so that they've got all their resources in one location. So I'm just going to move into the manager's view now. So as a manager, they would also have the My Leave tab, but also the Leave Management tab. So you can see here I've got a nice big alert that tells me that I've got one pending leave request that I need to action as the manager. So if I just come into pending leave requests, I can see there that Ted Goodman has requested some leave for annual leave, and it's pending my approval. So I can either approve or reject that, and an email will go off to Ted to let him know that it's either been approved or rejected. Or potentially I can't sign off on this one as his manager. I need to reassign it to another manager for approval, so they can then actually allocate it to somebody else. So under the approval history as a manager, I can see all the leave history that I've approved in the past for my employees or direct reports, and what periods that the leave is for. So the next area is down into the leave processing. So the user type of what we call a HR manager or a payroll processor or an administrator will see this next area. An employee or a leave approver will not. Okay, so they can actually create leave on behalf of an employee. So as an example, say an employee was sick and they weren't going to be back in the office for a little while, the HR manager can actually create a leave request on behalf of an employee. So they can select the employee, enter the leave period, what type of leave, and allocate that to a manager to approve. Potentially they can upload the supporting information that they've received regarding that leave request. So it just gives that flexibility that if an employee can't enter leave, you can still actually enter leave on their behalf. So when it comes to payroll processing day, or this actually can be checked at any time, they just enter in what is the last pay run date for the cycle, and it'll show you all leave requests that haven't been, I guess, sent to Attaché BI or Attaché for processing. So they can basically review any that haven't been approved. So say there was a manager that was not in on that day, they can allocate it to somebody else, or they can approve on behalf of that manager. So it's a good way to check all leave before it's obviously being finally processed of what is going to be processed in the next period of the pay. The next step is to actually then process that for payroll. So this is actually creating a file that can then be imported into Attaché BI that then is added to your timesheets to bring in all that leave. So it basically removes all that manual entry that you're doing into BI from the various different forms that you might have at the moment, whether they're paper forms or Excel. It then automatically creates a file for you that you can import into payroll. So I'll just select the date. So we do offer for all countries as well, so whether it be Australia, New Zealand, depending on what your company actually focuses on. And then it'll give me a visual look at all the leave that's coming over, and then I can just process and download a file. So that just creates a timesheet file that can then be imported into Attaché BI. So once we actually export that file, it needs to be saved in a particular location. But to import it into Attaché, it's as simple as going transactions, payroll, this file entries. So we always test first to make sure that there's no problems with the file, and then we would read that file in. So that would then automatically bring over all leave entries that have been entered into Express Leave for that particular period. There is a whole bunch of reports that we also have as well. As I mentioned before, the audit report is one that tells you that if an employee approver or someone has approved a particular employee's leave that they aren't set up to be their manager for, it will display on this report. And we also have the leave balance report. So if you are bringing balances over from Attaché BI into Express Leave, as a HR manager, you can then obviously see who has quite a large balance of leave, or long service leave or sick leave. Obviously, as business owners, we want to keep the liability as low as we can around annual leave. So, it's a nice quick visual report that potentially, the HR person or the payroll processor can then have discussions with managers about suggesting that some staff take some leave. So it's just a nice, quick, simple way to see where those leave balances might be quite high, but also the opposite of potentially anyone that's in a negative, and that we need to, make managers aware. I did forget to mention as well that on the leave request, the manager does see the leave balance that the employee has as well. So they do have that visibility before they approve any type of leave, that they can actually see what leave balance they have available to take. So there's no sort of, I guess as a company, you have the ability to have that visibility to say, no, you don't have enough, or reject it if need be. So that's all for today on Express Leave. I might just check if there's any questions that need to be answered. If not, we will send out all the questions and answers to Brendan and the team, who can then distribute them to all of you. So thank you very much for attending the webinar, and I'll be with you in 1 second. We'll just see if there's any questions. Okay, so there's just a couple of questions around Express Leave. So at the moment with Express Leave, what we've done is it's a lightweight solution where we're trying to take out the employee can sometimes get things wrong. So at this stage, when it comes to requesting leave, they can only request it based on days or half days. So that is driven by their employee setup. So if you've defined that an employee works 7.6 hours per day, that is what their day is the equivalent when they're requesting. So at this stage, we don't have the ability for the employee to just request for 1 hour or 2 hours. We are looking at making some enhancements around this area, but as a starting point, we tried to make it as simple as possible, so that obviously when that gets to the HR manager, it's nice and easy for them to know that the employee has entered things correctly because they've defined it what a day is for those employees. But if you do stay tuned, we are looking to make some enhancements around that area, but at this stage it's based on days and half days. And there was one other. So when leave is rejected through the manager approval, at this stage the rejection doesn't allow you to then enter a message in so that goes back to the employee. It's purely just an email that's a standard email that said, this leave has been rejected for this period. But definitely we'll take that on board and see if we can potentially make any enhancements around that area. And I think there might be one other. Let me just have a look. So there was another question around, we have additional annual leave. Any leave elements can be listed in the software in Express Leave. So if I just come under Manage Leave Types, you can create any number of leave items that apply for your company. So if you've got, annual leave for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, etc., if you want the employee to be able to apply for different types of leave, you can create as many as you like. It's all driven by what is then being exported back into Attaché BI as well. So just keep that in mind, that you must reference what codes you're wanting to then flow back into the timesheet. So that was all for questions. If you find that there's others that you think of after today, more than happy if you want to send them through to Brendan or ourselves or the support team, we're happy to help. Or if you want to know any more, please, more than happy to answer any questions. The other thing I did want to mention as well was, if you didn't know already, we have this really great help centre that has a lot of documentation that's been going into it over the last few years. So any of the termination elements that we've been spoken about today can actually be found in the Help Centre as well. So for those of you that have BI, the Help Centre will be one of your tabs. For those that are still using accounts, if you just go to myattache.com, you'll find the Help Centre as well. So really great search functionality. There's a little video about the termination pay calculator and all the different steps that we went through today. There is also the Express Leave section as well. So if you had any further wanting to know about the setups or how it actually comes together, there's a whole big section on Express Leave as well. So it's all in the Attaché Help Centre, so myattache.com. So thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time out today to attend the webinar. So thank you very much.